we have said, there is very little doubt that the NSN will be banned. But Australian nationalists have deep reservations concerning our own security apparatus and, of course, the security agencies overseas. It was said in the 60 Minutes program that the NSN had links to a US-based group called Atomwaffen. Indeed, in Australia, a spin-off from Atomwaffen called Sonnenkrieg, an English-based group, was not too long ago proclaimed as a terrorist organisation. However, the American group Atomwaffen has one very, very interesting aspect to it. It appears that its current leader, Joshua Sutter, has been exposed in court proceedings as a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent, FBI, and that he was paid money to take over the group and steer it in the direction of terrorism. This is something that's probably not surprising, but here we are. We're dealing with FBI again. The FBI has a long history in the United States of disrupting organisations, leading organisations, and being involved with people who are committing terrorism offences. Also in the United States, an organisation came into being called the Base. This organisation, which obviously echoed Al-Qaeda, which means in Arabic the base, drew itself to the attention of authorities very, very quickly. However, it was drawn to the attention of authorities even more quickly because its leader, Ronaldo Nazzaro, had previously worked for Homeland Security in the US, and according to many of the former members of this association, where in fact it was run by the FBI, that Nazzaro himself was an FBI agent. Recently, in some media, it was exposed that Nazzaro had actually been an FBI analyst. It seems that Nazzaro fled to Russia. Did it get too hot for him? Was the base, I should say, leading to the situation where there may be some serious violent act, and did Nazzaro actually fear for his own life and he shot through? Well, we'll never know. It's very likely if he fled to Russia, he was actually debriefed by the FSB, Russia's internal security service, because of a lot of the links of neo-Nazis to a group operating in Ukraine called the Azov Battalion. Very recently, of course, some newspapers and commentators are suggesting that aspects of American neo-Nazism, including the base, are in some manner or other a Russian security plot. This is a quite remarkable thing because it covers over the obvious that these groups were not the creation of Russia engaged in a dirty tricks operation, but the creation of the United States' own intelligence network, the FBI. We know in Britain, one of the organisations that was greatly favoured by Australian neo-Nazis was a group called National Action, now banned as a terrorist group in the UK. It planned a couple of its events with MI5, Britain's internal security agency, sitting there right at the table. Needless to say, the practitioners of NA violence found themselves in prison very, very quickly. The program, The Nazis Next Door, also naturally made allusions to a famous group called Combat 18, or Combat Adolf Hitler, to give it its kitsch name. Many of the members of the British group Combat 18, the original members of it, ultimately came to the conclusion that it was itself an MI5 honey trap. Since that time, when the former members of it exposed that fact in the 1990s, an incredible operation has been put in place to muddy the waters. It's been said, no, that's not true, that was simply an allegation, it's not backed up by the evidence, but overwhelmingly it appears to be. Combat 18, for all its rhetoric about race wars and violence and attacking the lefties and all the rest of it, seemed much more to target nationalists and would-be nationalists than it ever did anybody else. That's also a dead set giveaway. Combat 18 still exists. Whether it's still a honey trap or not, well, you make up your own mind. We already have. In some writing by nationalists, it's been put that one of the methods used by security services is called the Okhrana method. The Okhrana was the secret police force of the famous Russian Tsar Nicholas II. It often follows that the Okhrana would create violent groups or underground groups. They'd help them organise to act. The groups would go and recruit members because only the Okhrana agent would know what its actual purpose was. The group would give justification to the lives of activists. And then, suddenly, the group would be swooped upon and all of the recruits cleaned up and the group discredited in front of people who wanted to oppose Tsarism. Often these groups would have contacts that would then discredit other groups. They would also sometimes act in a way that their activism would look like another group. They also tended to target, if I can use the phrase, the legitimate Russian revolutionaries. This model appears to be applied to this very day. Some people now call these sorts of groups counter-gangs. In fact, in the history of NSN, not long before its sad denouement recently, there were attempts by some of its members to mirror the thoughts and slogans of Australian nationalism. Now, the Director General of the Australian Security Organisation knows all this. He knows the history of these groups overseas, how they've been infiltrated and so on, and what they do. If he doesn't, again, he's not doing his job. For our listeners, they might like to take a moment or two, when they can, to look up online a British police website. The British police website is called Operation Kenova, Kenova. After public outcry in the UK and also in Northern Ireland from all sides of that conflict and from many sincere British people, British police were ordered to investigate the dirty war in Northern Ireland and up to 200 murders and other events. It seems that MI5 and organs of the British Army had infiltrated paramilitaries on both sides of that conflict. It is alleged that the IRA's chief of intelligence was himself a British agent. This sort of chicanery, if you like, has an incredible outcome on political events. Operation Kenova, of course, involves actual terrorism and murder. The so-called far right in Australia is described by the Director General as a threat that might produce lone wolf attacks or some violence. We're dealing with a, shall we say, far more civil version of the type of threat to public order that Operation Kenova is currently investigating. But the methodologies employed by MI5 and the military groups in Northern Ireland is really my point. What would occur if an organisation heading down the so-called terrorist road was manipulated? What would happen if events took place that were highly criminal acts? If we go back in time, well back in time, we can see how operations can work that integrate together intelligence and boots on the ground and media to arrive at particular results. Back in 1978, 43 years ago, another time in Australian politics, there was some concern in the multicultural industry that there could be an attempt by some Australians to create an organisation akin to the then popular and rising British National Front. A small group of people assembled in Melbourne who decided that that's exactly what they wanted to do, and in fact they wanted to copy the British National Front's ideology up to and including being essentially a part of the National Front. They organised a foundation meeting on a date in June of 1978. The meeting was infiltrated by a Fairfax journalist. The meeting took place on a Saturday, and on the Monday morning, Fairfax ran an extravaganza throughout the country about right-wing extremists ready to organise race hate and so on, and it appeared under the byline of a David Wilson. David Wilson has a very interesting history in that Joan Coxidge, an upper house Victorian MP who ran a remarkable group called the Campaign Against Political Police, suggested that the Fairfax journalist was himself some sort of ASIO agent. Now, I've had the pleasure of examining ASIO's actual reports on that meeting that was organised in Melbourne all those years ago. It was a comprehensive and detailed report as to the conversations at the meeting, the persons who attended and other things that tended to indicate that it was not necessarily the product of a bugging operation, but the product of an operation that had a physical agent present. The document was not signed. David Wilson was mentioned, and it was mentioned in the report that he was an Age journalist. When one plays, if you like, the shell game as to how many people were present, who they were, and who did what, one is left with the inevitable conclusion that the ASIO agent was the Age journalist. You would imagine that an extravaganza like this would stymie a political group, and if you thought that, well, you'd be right. But 3 days after the Saturday meeting, the media in Sydney produced the leader of the National Front. And who was it? An obscure Australian neo-Nazi called Bob Cameron. He acted on camera as a first-class galah and talked about, let's just say, racial themes that were offensive, and did a lot of media interviews over the following couple of days exactly along that line. Many days later, on the following weekend, 3 men were arrested not far from his former home in the Sydney suburb of Yagoona by special branch officers and the notorious criminal cop Roger Rogerson, and accused of attempting to murder Bob Cameron to stymie his racism. This became the famous Ananda Marga case that stained New South Wales justice for 7 or 8 years and had consequences that went well beyond that. It could be said that this National Front and the fallout from the Ananda Marga case helped to stymie the development of true nationalism for some time. Yes and no, but certainly it left a bad taste as a genuine nationalist movement sought to emerge in Australia. The point that can be made is here we have an operation that clearly involved the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation and Fairfax Media. Let's come back forward now into the present. You might say that the aim of the program was also to equate certain ideas. In recent media reports, the neo-Nazis have been described as nationalists, and indeed the Director General himself has used that language on a few occasions. The neo-Nazis are, of course, not nationalists of any description, Australian or any other. Clearly, there was an opportunity, using the Okrana method, to steer neo-Nazism against Australian nationalism. Well, that certainly won't be happening now, at least according to the usual formula. Quite the contrary. But what can still happen is in any upcoming trials of Mr. Sewell or any of his supporters, or in the fallout from this program, or any other media that will operate around the themes of the program, it may well be suggested that there is some link or connection or ideological similarity between the growing nationalist movement and neo-Nazism. Needless to say, there is none, and nor is any sort. The Australian nationalists have, in one sense, and there is nothing wrong with having it, a conspiratorial view of the activities of these Australian neo-Nazis back over time. If we go back to the 1978 National Front operation, witnesses have told myself personally and others that the alleged victim of the Ananda Marga's crime was paid money by the Special Branch, $8,000 in fact, to play out his role as a so-called National Front leader. I would not be in the least surprised that another organisation will take the place of NSN before too long. Who it will be led by, well, who knows? But the story will be the same. We saw in the program a big attempt by the journalist and so on to paint the organisation as the hardest of the hard and the tough of the tough. One of the funny things that came out of it, however, was the commentary allegedly made by Mr. Sewell that he was looking for support inside the Liberal Party. This has since been, of course, and quite rightly so, denied by the Liberals. But it's one of those myths that's often held out to people in pseudo-extremist politics, that there's also the Conservative road. It's like a coin. In discussions with true nationalists, I call it the coin. On one side of the coin, you have super RR revolutionaries ready to jump down the throat of anyone and lead to the promised land by violence. And on the other side, you have infiltration strategies where they go and work inside mainstream parties to convert and so on and so forth. Both of these sort of strategies have no faith in the Australian people or the people generally to act in accordance with some sort of nationalist principle or to mobilise a nationalist movement on the ground. The neo-Nazis, of course, we have not heard the end of them. It is expected that the Tom Sewell trial will feature various claims that will be made that will sour the Australian political debate over matters of immigration and so on for some time. But listeners should realise in the discussion of neo-Nazism, are we to a large extent dealing with a type of phantom? There is no doubt that there are some people who believe what is said. The interpretation of German National Socialism, which is offered, that it's some sort of ideology designed to help out white folks, that was never true. But it will continue to reappear. We might see that neo-Nazism will be engendered in one way or another almost spontaneously, that young people may find it online and be attracted to it because, as George Orwell put it, we live in an age of universal deceit. And if something has been lied about, well, Nazism could have been lied about too, and consequently recruits will be found for it. So the birth of a successor to NSN is almost inevitable. But the best cure for all provocations, whether they come from the security services or from silly people, is to build a proper Australian nationalist organisation, which makes that somewhat impossible. I'd strongly advise all Australian nationalists and other genuine patriots to begin the study, the close order study of these neo-Nazis in practice. It's not a question of what they may say, but judge it by what it does and how it operates. This is the key question. Once one grasps that, one can reason backwards and arrive at a higher truth. Thank you for listening. Any questions can be directed to me in the usual way. Good evening.